Took a little pouring break, but we're going to go back to the serious stuff. No laughing today.
Yeah.
Actually, it was pretty serious last week too, if I remember correctly. But this is back to our topic of how much can a worker eat of his. And actually, so the conversation shifted a bit, and we spent a while proving that the worker could eat. So there was a bunch of interesting material on workers' rights. And actually, even the rights of your animals and humane treatment of workers and animals, it's shifted now to limiting how much the worker can eat because the focus now is on the owner. So it's interesting. And it's not like there's chapter headings in the Talmud where it says, okay, here's workers' rights and here's now the rights of the owner, of the employer. But you can sort of see how the conversation shifts, and you have a sense of the dialectics in Judaism too, how you care about both sides of the equation. You can't just like pound out. I mean, I'm not making a political statement, but you can't just pound out workers' rights. Someone is paying for those workers' rights, so then you have to look at the other equation also. And the Talmud's very good at that. So, anyway, we're going to go back. We're going to go to 192, just to get us back into the rhythm of the discussion. And I'm not going to go through the complicated exegesis that brings us to this statement, but we end up with a series of workers who are not allowed to eat. So I'm going to not allowed to eat on the job. So that's 192. It's 8, verse 8. Yatsa halash. So the person who kneads dough, a mikatef, is somebody who shapes it. Va'ofet, and the baker. Okay, so those people can't eat on the job. They can't eat what they're baking. Basically, those are people that are baking, involved in the baking process. And now they give a reason, because the final act has been done already. And here they're defining the final act. And this goes back to what we talked about before, is that the suggestion is that you can eat as long as you're not involved in the final act of making it a product. Now you have to define what that means, the final act. You might think that baking is, so they decide that baking is not. That ritual of challah, where you take the tiny bit of dough, you burn it all up. It's all in memory of something that happened in the temple. That's the final act that makes it a product. Anything after that, you're not allowed to eat on the job. Anything before that, you are. Okay. De'ein poel chilba, so the worker doesn't eat it. Okay. Now, so here's the question. So the question is that I thought we'd already established that the final act is tithing, which actually goes back to grain, which means that it's not just the baker and the person who's kneading that can't eat. Anything that comes after tithing, which is just separating the grain. So there's a bunch of stuff, bunch of jobs that come after that. They also wouldn't be allowed to eat. And now it's a very interesting little objection that I'll spend a few minutes talking on. I mean, not a lot of time because it takes us away from our topic. But lo kasha, it's not a difficulty. So the difficulty they're talking about is we suggested two actions that end the job of making the product a finished product, and the practical implication is when is the worker allowed to eat or not allowed to eat? So lo kasha, and those two are challah, right? Challah is taking a bit of dough. For there to be dough, there has to be kneading and baking, kneading, and so, or is it challah, or is it maser, or is it tithing? Lo kasha b'chutza la'aretz askinan. So we're in saying that it's the baker that's not allowed to eat. We're talking about anything outside of Israel, deleka maser, because there's no tithing outside of Israel. So it's interesting how the discussion brings us to a significant ritual difference. It's a ritual difference between people that live in the land of Israel and us, who live in the diaspora. And it's not a philosophical difference here, really, although it kind of flows from a philosophical difference, but it's a halachic difference. A halachic difference is that in Israel they are required to tithe, and outside of Israel, you're not required to tithe. And I was just, I've done a little bit of reading recently about the different challenges that Jews face living in Israel, living outside of Israel, and therefore the different reality, and therefore sort of the different worldview that emerges just because of the different reality that we live in. And I heard a really interesting lecture where the guy put it like this, that in America, let's say North America. So in North America, Jews, and don't jump on this because it's a generalization. I understand that there's exceptions. But in North America, Jews live surrounded by goodwill. for the most part. So for the most part, I mean, our non-Jewish neighbors are, I mean, honestly, compared to most of history. I mean, Jews live surrounded by goodwill. Most of us have very good relationships with our neighbors, where we are not in any way stopped from being Jewish by anybody around. So it's a pretty good time to be Jewish if you look at the long term of Jewish history. So we're surrounded by goodwill. So therefore, we've been able to flourish here with building institutions. The only thing that stops us is our imagination, lack of resources. But for the most part, we can do whatever we want because we're surrounded by goodwill. And the fact is, there are surveys that say that Jews are very highly thought of in the United States, for good reasons, I should add. But very highly thought of. Whereas in Israel, Israeli Jews are surrounded by the opposite of goodwill, right? People that want them dead, people that are inhospitable to being there. Not just talking about the Palestinians in general. The whole neighborhood is opposed to the Zionist project, which means opposed to living as a free people in our land, and that leads to, in the end, it leads to different ways of looking at the world. And so that's an existential difference. Existential in the sense of how you live creates maybe your ideology. Now, here they're talking about just a difference in halakha, right? I mean, they're focused. So the difference in halakha is that they tithe and we don't. But I'm gonna keep going because it delves into it. That it comes back to the topic anyway. Was there a comment? I'm not sure. Was there? People. Okay. Page 193. Ihachi chala namileka. So wait a second. I said if that's the case, if the issue here is the difference between Israel and the diaspora, then the same should hold for challah. The challah, remember, is taking a little bit of dough, which I've told you I remember my grandmother doing, and many of you have memories, or maybe you do it now. When you bake challah, you burn up just a tiny piece of it. It turns out that's also only required in the land of Israel, right? And not in the diaspora. So it should be in the same category as tithing. Now, why did my grandmother do it? I said before, don't insult her. She understood Jewish law. She wasn't mistaken, and she wasn't living in Israel. It's that rabbis ordained. It doesn't come. We've I think studied the difference between Doraita and Derabanan. Doraita is a law that's in the Bible. Derabanan is a law that comes from the rabbis. So the rabbis, in the 2nd, 3rd century, decided Jews in the diaspora should also do challah. What they didn't decide necessarily, we'll look at it a little bit, is that Jews outside of Israel should tithe. Now, why would that? What's the difference? What's the difference between tithing and challah? Challah is that little ritual act of burning up the dough.
One's for people, one's for God.
Yeah. Right. The tithing goes to support an institution, the temple. Or if it's not the temple, because it happened in Israel even after the temple was destroyed. But it's to support Jewish bureaucracy. And in the diaspora, there's a Jewish bureaucracy. We have a Jewish bureaucracy in San Diego too. But it's more diffuse. It's not centralized. It's not the state. Whereas in Israel, it was sovereignty. So it was paying taxes. You have to pay your taxes. The diaspora, taxes are going to be figured much differently. Now, there were communities that decided on tithing, and therefore it came to Rabbanan. But it's even a little bit deeper too. So, because in Israel, as the agricultural homeland, there's an attachment to the land, right? Even if you're not a farmer. I mean, there's a time in history where all people stopped being farmers primarily and started being merchants and there's industry. But there's something special about the land of Israel. That's what they're getting at, to the soil of the land of Israel that ends up producing the produce creates a greater ritual obligation than the soil of Cleveland, Ohio, the soil of San Diego, California. So therefore, tithing is much more connected to the soil. It's agricultural. It's when you take stuff out of the ground. And they're hinting there, that's one of the differences between Israel and the rest of the world, Israel and the diaspora, is that there's a sacred dimension to the space, to the soil. So we pay, whereas challah is just baking. I mean, let's say the challah is far enough removed from the agricultural dimension that you can add it to the diaspora without. But the tithing is so tied to agriculture and Israel, the land, is so central. Yeah, and by the way, so in the return to the land in Zionism, of course, agriculture took a very central dimension again. through the kibbutz movement. And even nowadays, and I had an interesting talk with an Israeli not that long ago, there's still this powerful attachment in Israel to the land, to the soil, even though 98% of Israelis are not at all involved in agriculture. And the kibbutz movement and moshavs are a very tiny part of the day-to-day life of Israelis. Although, by the way, a big part of the economy. It's still a big part of the economy, but still the connection to the land. And you really don't understand things like settlements, which are really difficult political issues, unless you understand that tie of the Israeli Jew to the land. Probably there's a tie of the Palestinian Arab to the land too, but there's a tie of the Palestinian Jew to the land, and that feeling, which you have here in the Talmud already, pervades the politics, and we don't understand it as much. Yeah.
I was thinking about this because of the Jewish values in the land, and I was thinking about, when I was a little girl, I saved money for JNF, plant trees, and we still plant trees. So in a way, we still have a connection.
The land I mean, what do we call Israel? Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, the land of Israel. We don't call the United States the land of the United States.
No.
The fact that our official name for Israel is Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. Yeah. Okay, all right, we'll go on. Page 193. El L'Olam Ba'aretz. Okay, so no, this is all. And by the way, I mean it's interesting. What's the colloquial word for Israel, both then and now? Haaretz. Yeah, Haaretz just means the land, right? It's not Hamakom. Hamidina could be Hamakom is place, Medina is state. Or
just Israel.
It's the land. No, it's Haaretz. 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 Everybody. There's the most famous newspaper in Israel is Haaretz, and people still use that as I return Haaretz. Yeah. Okay. Okay. L'Olam Ba'aretz. So we're talking about in the land. In other words, the land of Israel. V'lo kasha. Okay. And it's not a difficulty. So this is interesting. B'sheva shekivshu, uv'sheva shechilku. Okay, so there was a period during the time of Joshua. It took 7 years for Joshua. Remember, Joshua succeeds Moses, so they're coming from the desert, the 40 years wandering in the desert. It took 7 years to conquer the land, and then 7 years to divide it among the 12 tribes. So that 7 years of dividing must have been an interesting time, negotiating who gets what land. So it took 7 years. It's amazing it didn't take 70 years, but it took 7 years. Demar Mar, because we have a statement. Sheva shekivshu. The Sheva Shechilku, that's 14 years. Nidchayvu b'chala. During those 14 years, chala was required. And when you're baking bread, you had to burn that little bit. V'lo nidchayvu b'maser. But they didn't require tithing because things were too unsettled. Right. So and there wasn't a bureaucracy of sorts to really support in those days. They hadn't built a temple yet, so at that point they weren't requiring maser. So when we talk about maser, we talk about challah being the end of the product, of creating the product in Israel. It was only for those 14 years, and they're saying that particular teaching was during that 14-year period where challah was the end. Otherwise, actually maser, tithing, actually is the end product. Okay. Okay, now it takes a step back and it's trying to says, well, let's try to figure, and this is important sometimes in the Talmud, let's try to focus on what we're talking about here instead of going about the 14 years and what's the difference between the diaspora and Israel. Midi maser kagarim. Let's go back and figure out, we're talking about when does a worker stop eating, what workers are not allowed to eat on the job, and we've already figured out it's anything after the end of the product. So what creates the end of the product? Midi maser kagarim. Are we sure? Do we really want to say for sure that tithing completes the product, creating the product? Gemar malacha kagarim. Okay, it's whatever we get to define that. Why you don't have to define it as tithing. You define it as when the work is done. So then you have to. So when is the work done on a particular product? Okay. So turn the page. And now we're going to come up with the decisive statement on this, which I have to say is not so decisive to me. I'm having a hard time understanding it, but I'll give it a try anyway. Page 194. El Amar Ravina. So Ravina says, and when you get to Ravina, remember Ravina, he's the person that edited the Talmud. You're getting to decisive statements. Either they're bored with the discussion already, like you and I, or they've actually figured it out. It takes generations to figure it out. El Amar Ravina. Ravina says, Kruch v'tane. Kruch is like a sandwich. Put the two ideas together and say it this way. Daish, and we started this with threshing. So threshing. What is threshing? Because there is some teaching, I can't even remember, weeks ago, where threshing is the end product. So because threshing is actually mentioned in the Torah itself as they're allowing the worker to eat and allowing the animal to eat while they're threshing. Ma diyesh miuchad. Okay, so what's unique about it? Davar shelo nigmar melachato. It's not the total end. Lemaser chala, because you haven't tithed yet and you haven't done the chala. U poel ochelbo, and a worker can eat by it. Af. So here's the rule. Kol shelo nigmar melachato lemaser u lechala poel ochelbo. Anything where it's not the final act, whether it's maser or chala, so maser meaning maser in general, or chala, we're just talking about those 14 years. Or if it's the diaspora, it's just chala. In other words, you put it all together, and now you've got an inclusive statement that includes the 14 years, and includes the diaspora, includes Israel, poel chelbo. So whatever is the end of the work. So in general, the end of the work is maser, except of course for those 14 years in Israel and anywhere outside of Israel. Otherwise, it's chala. And now we have the general statement of those workers are at the end, after the end of putting together the product, the workers aren't allowed to eat. Okay, and sort of changing the subject now. Any questions at all?
Who defines what the end of the product is?
They just defined it right there. Those rabbis just defined it. It's tithing for the most part, unless you don't live in Israel, and then it's chala. Unless you happen to live in Israel during those 14 years. I mean, who cares? Honestly, who cares about those 14 years? It's not going to affect us. But yeah.
If it's grapes.
Okay. So if it's grapes,
you
tithe everything. You tithe all produce. You tithe grapes too. That's why it works for grapes. Yeah. You don't thresh grapes,
and
but you.
Somebody in that point says, "I'm going to tithe now," so you have to stop eating.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So you could.
The jobs. It's more like the jobs after tithing.
Right.
Yeah.
So an analogy.
Like if you're picking the grapes, you eat as much as you want. After you separated the grapes, okay, this go to the government. I get to keep this. Then whatever work is done after that, for instance, taking it to the market, smashing it to make wine, anything else after that, you can't eat.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Analogously to the challah would be wine making. So is it when the wine is finished or?
Yeah. So it's interesting. So in Israel, of course, you can't drink any of the wine that you make. In the diaspora, you can drink as much as you want because there's no challah for the wine. Yeah.
Is tithing a continuous process? Or is it something like once a month or once a year?
I think it's once a year. It's in the Torah. First of all, it's a good question. I'm not sure. I think it's just once a year, though. In the Torah, you've got the whole tithing ceremony, where you make a statement and you say, here you go.
Celebration or mourning?
Yeah. It's interesting. It's a celebration. It's a celebration. You should be thrilled to be supporting your government. Right. It's a shechianu. Every time you send your check off to the IRS, you should be saying a shechianu. I'm privileged to be living in this country. I mean, if we did things like that, maybe we wouldn't have all these anti-government movements, right? We built in, I'm so pleased to be supporting my government, and that's it. Yes.
This is kind of related, but what about having a land life value? Do you have to, like every 7 years?
Yeah.
Do you have to do it outside the land of Israel? Because this is relevant to the farming at Lishtag, because they're doing it.
So I mean, they can choose to do it, but you don't have to. The agricultural laws. This is, I think it's interesting. Before, the agricultural laws are restricted entirely to the land of Israel. It's the soil of the land of Israel. You could put it this way: it's the soil of the land of Israel that mandates these particular laws. I mean, it's God, but you do so. Therefore, actually, in the Talmud, because this isn't the place where we discuss Maser so much, but in the Talmud, the important work is defining what's the land of Israel. Because even in those days, they're going to say, okay, well, I'll buy a little farm out here, just across the border. I won't have to tithe. I mean, I think that's the right. Does that sound familiar? I mean, that's right. So,
Offshore. It's like having an offshore account.
Right. So therefore, for the rabbis, they kept on expanding. We think they expand the borders in the Talmud of the land of Israel for political purposes. It's not for political purposes at all. It's not because they have this imagination of the greater land of Israel. They were trying to or prohibit tax cheats. They were trying to limit that. Which I'll have a farm right here. It's Syria. No, we're going to call that Israel too. Just the.
Could you elaborate on?
Municipalities do that a lot in order to bring in revenue. Yeah.
Could you elaborate on these rules of wine in and out of Israel? You started to say something about.
Oh, I was mostly just joking, since I don't really know. But since in Israel the end of the work, since in Israel at the end of the work is tithing. So once you've tithed the grapes, you can't eat anymore. So if you're making wine, you can't eat on the job, can't drink on the job. But outside of Israel, there's no tithing. So the end product of making the wine would say you'd have to pick something else, maybe once it gets in the bottle. But before it gets in the bottle, you can drink as much as you want.
I think we in the United States would be happy with tithing. A 10.
Oh yeah. For certain people, yeah. Okay. All right, let's keep going. 195.
One thing, Rabbi.
Yeah.
Did they have many temples before they built the central temple?
Oh, clearly they did, yeah.
So was there tithing involved with those?
Well, all it says here, nobody knows. I mean, it's impossible to know, really. There's no mention of it in the book of Joshua, for instance, but the Talmud here suggests that there was this 14-year period where there wasn't tithing, and after that there was. Now, whether that's historic or not, unlikely, actually, but that was their idea. Their idea is there was some kind of tithing even before David conquered Jerusalem and Solomon built the temple. That's a long period of time. That's more than 14 years. So they're saying that tithing started even before that. I don't think there's any record of that. Other than Leviticus suggests, Leviticus and Deuteronomy command it. So then you have to look in when were those books actually written, when were they followed. Okay. Page 195. Ibayalahu. A question was asked. Poel. So this is a whole different, it's still workers eating, but it's a different dimension of it. Poel mahu shiavhe ba'or v'yochal. Okay, can a worker take some grain and cook it?
Yeah.
Okay, so cooking it will make it taste better, right? You've got raw grain. We talked about raw grain, but cooking will make it taste better. And if he's allowed to cook it, then he's going to eat more. It's a good question, right? Here, the idea is protecting the owner. Okay, yes, clearly the worker can eat whatever he or she wants, but can they do something to make it more enhancing? And one would be to cook it. Okay, that's the question. Mi havi ka'anavim v'davar acher. Ola. Okay, so is it like grapes? Okay, so with grapes we actually have a rule already that we've learned that you can't add anything to grapes. I guess it would be sugar. I don't know, whatever spice you like. Yeah. You can't add anything to grapes to enhance their flavor, so you'd want it more. Okay, is cooking like that? Cooking the grain. That's the question. Okay? And there's a given in the question. The given is we already know about grapes. Grapes you can't add anything. But is cooking adding something? Okay? All right, so I'm going to spend a little time on that. Because it turns out to be a pretty far-reaching question. Because it's getting into how much can the employee eat, and how much can the employer afford to have the employee eat. Tashma, here's the teaching. Rashai balabait lashkot po'olim yain. Okay, so an employer is allowed to give the workers wine. It must have been a particular kind of wine, because the point of that wine you're going to see is to retard the appetite. Right? It's almost like can the employer give the employees a bunch of junk food, which doesn't cost very much, to retard their appetite, so they don't feel like eating as much. So they won't eat a lot of grapes. These are the grapes. And also, Risha'in po'olim litabel pitam batsir. So you learn a little bit about medieval, early medieval dietary practices and the way they would enhance or not enhance appetite. So and it doesn't work for me. I don't really get it. But there was an appetite stimulant where you could dip your pita into salt in order to enhance your appetite. So you want to eat more. Workers were allowed to do that. Kadesh yochlu anavim harbe. So workers could eat a lot of grapes. Okay? So I don't really understand the science of it, how somehow putting bread in salt would enhance your appetite. I don't know if anybody here understands that too. Unless it's somehow making you more thirsty, and eating the grapes make you thirsty. Could be. Okay. And I always understood that wine actually increases your appetite. But here is saying the wine would decrease the appetite. But the principle is what matters. The principle is that the employer is allowed to give extra kinds of food that will decrease the appetite, whereas the employee is allowed to do things that will increase the appetite. That's allowed. Okay, but the thing, so and for both, it's eating something. Okay, so that would seem to prove that yes, of course, the worker can cook the grain because we already have a teaching that they can add things to increase their own appetite, but maybe not. Okay, this is 9 on 195. Lachshure gavra lo mikabalan. Okay, well, so doing something to the person, that's not the question. So these things are doing something to the person, giving the person something to eat to decrease the appetite, or eating something yourself to increase the appetite. That's doing something to the person, but that's not what I asked. What I asked was, Kimi Bailan, when we're asking, Lachshure pera. We're wondering if you can do something to the produce itself to make it more palatable. Are you allowed to do it or not? And next week we will discuss that.